My wife let her family hold our newborn every day, but banned mine from even seeing a photo. Then her sister showed me the texts. That was the moment I realized this was not postpartum anxiety, not boundaries, not safety, and not anything close to what my wife had been telling me. This was a plan. Our daughter had been born 3 weeks earlier, and from the day we brought her home, my wife Jessica refused to let anyone from my side of the family meet her. Not my parents, who lived only 20 minutes away. Not my sister, who had flown in from across the country after planning her visit for months. Not even my grandmother, who was 92 years old and might not have many chances left to hold her first great-granddaughter. Meanwhile, Jessica's family came over every day, like our house belonged to them. Her mother practically lived in the nursery. Her father had already taken hundreds of photos. Her siblings came and went whenever they felt like it, opening our fridge, sitting on our couch, holding my daughter, kissing her forehead, acting like everything was normal. But when my mother called and asked when she could meet her first grandchild, Jessica would start crying about boundaries, safety, and needing space. The excuses changed constantly. First, Jessica said it was because of germs and the baby's immune system, but her family was coming straight from jobs at a daycare, a hospital, and a gym. Then she said she did not want the baby overwhelmed, but her family had thrown a party in our living room when our daughter was only 5 days old, with 15 people crowding around her bassinet. Then Jessica said she was trying to establish routines, but her mother rearranged our entire schedule every time she came over. My mother offered to wear a mask. She offered to wash her hands, stay outside, look through the window, anything, just to see the baby one time. Jessica said that was creepy and obsessive. When my mom sent a gift, Jessica returned it and said we did not have room for more stuff, while her own mother had already filled the nursery with things we did not need and had never asked for. I tried talking to Jessica about fairness, but she told me life was not fair, and I needed to respect her as a mother. She said she had gone through labor, so she got to make the rules about who saw the baby. When I reminded her that I was the father, she told me I did not understand the bond between a mother and child, and that I was being controlling. Her mother backed her up, saying new mothers needed support, not arguments, while looking at me like I was some kind of abuser for wanting my parents to meet my daughter. My sister had planned her entire trip around meeting the baby. She had taken time off work, bought a plane ticket, and booked a hotel so she would not impose on us. Jessica had known about the visit for months, but when my sister arrived, Jessica suddenly developed anxiety about visitors and said she could not handle anyone outside her immediate support system, which apparently meant only her blood relatives. My sister sat alone in her hotel room for 4 days, waiting for permission to meet her niece, before she finally flew home heartbroken. While all of this was happening, Jessica posted on social media about how hard motherhood was. Her friends commented that she was doing amazing, that she was so strong, that she was protecting her peace. At the same time, my father-in-law was posting photos of himself holding my daughter with captions about being the world's proudest grandpa. When my dad commented and asked when he could meet her, Jessica deleted the comment and blocked him. She told me he was being aggressive and crossing boundaries on her posts. The breaking point came when my grandmother called from the hospital. She had fallen and was being admitted for surgery. She asked if I could send her a photo of the baby before her operation, just in case. Jessica heard me on the phone and started screaming that I was emotionally manipulating her by using my grandmother's health. Then she grabbed my phone and told my grandmother that she was toxic for guilt-tripping a new mother, and she hung up. My grandmother was so confused, she thought she had done something terrible. That was when Jessica's sister, Amy, pulled me aside. She had been watching everything unfold, and she said she could not stay quiet anymore. Amy told me the real reason Jessica was keeping my family away. Before Jessica and I got married, she had been engaged to someone else named Christopher. Christopher's mother had been extremely involved in the wedding planning, and Jessica had hated it. When their relationship ended, Jessica swore she would never let another mother-in-law near any future children she had. Amy said Jessica had been planning this since she got pregnant. She had been telling her family she was going to establish dominance early and make sure my mother knew her place, which was nowhere near the baby. Amy said Jessica had an entire strategy about making my family beg and grovel, and then still saying no, just to break their spirits. She wanted them to give up trying so she would never have to deal with them. Then Amy showed me the text messages. Jessica had bragged about making my sister waste money on a trip for nothing, saying it would teach her not to assume she had a right to the baby. Amy also showed me Jessica's group chat with her friends, where Jessica was laughing about my grandmother being in the hospital. She called my grandmother dramatic and wrote that old people always used health scares for attention. Then she wrote that she hoped my grandmother would pass before the baby was old enough to remember her, so she would never have to deal with visits. I felt sick reading those words. This was not a stressed-out new mother trying to protect her child. This was my wife using our newborn as a weapon against people who had done nothing to her. I confronted Jessica with the messages, and she immediately tried to grab Amy's phone to delete them. But Amy had already sent them to me. Jessica screamed that Amy was jealous and a traitor to their sisterhood. Then she turned on me and said I was choosing my family over her and the baby. I told her I was choosing not to let her abuse my family anymore. That same day, I took our daughter to meet my parents. Jessica called the police and said I had kidnapped our daughter. When the officers arrived, they asked if I was the father. I said yes. They told Jessica I had equal rights to take my child places, and then they left. My parents were overwhelmed when I arrived with the baby. My mother cried before she even touched her. My father stood there frozen for a moment, like he was afraid if he moved too quickly, the moment would disappear. They washed their hands, sat down carefully, and held their granddaughter like she was made of glass. For the first time in 3 weeks, I felt like my daughter was surrounded by love that did not come with conditions or power games. But it did not stay peaceful for long. Jessica's mother showed up at my parents' house, demanding that I return the baby immediately. She stood on the porch, screaming my name, demanding that I hand over her granddaughter. My father held his phone steady and recorded every word while my mother stayed inside with the baby pressed against her shoulder. I stood behind the screen door and explained as calmly as I could that I was the father and I had every right to bring my daughter to see my parents. Jessica's mother turned red with rage. She yelled that I was a kidnapper, that I had stolen the baby, that Jessica was at home having a panic attack because of what I had done. My father kept filming without saying a word, just documenting everything. She threatened to call her lawyer right then and there. She said she would make sure I never saw my daughter again, that Jessica would get full custody, and that I would be lucky to get supervised visits once a month. My father zoomed in on her face as she said it, getting every threat clearly on video. After 20 minutes of screaming, she finally got back in her car and peeled out of the driveway, nearly hitting the mailbox on her way out. My parents and I stood there in silence for a moment before my mother asked if I was okay. I did not know how to answer. I drove home 3 hours later, knowing I needed to sit down with Jessica and have a real conversation about our marriage, about what was happening, and about whether anything between us could still be fixed. When I pulled into our driveway, every light in the house was on, and I could see shadows moving behind the windows. I walked through the front door and found Jessica's entire family in our living room. Her father stood up first and started yelling before I had even closed the door behind me. He called me a kidnapper. He said I had traumatized his daughter. He demanded to know what kind of man takes a baby away from her mother without permission. Jessica's mother joined in, saying I was trying to steal the baby, that I was dangerous, that they should call the police again. Her brother accused me of being controlling. One of her sisters said I was abusive. They all talked over one another, creating this wall of noise and anger. Jessica sat in the middle of the couch holding our daughter, tears running down her face, looking at me like I was a stranger who had broken into her home. I tried to speak, but her father cut me off, stepping closer and pointing his finger at my chest. Her mother pulled out her phone and started recording me, saying she wanted evidence of my aggressive behavior. I stood there with my hands at my sides, not moving, not yelling back, just letting them attack me while Jessica cried and played the victim. That was when I understood what was happening. She had already told them her version of events. She had already painted me as the villain. She had already made herself the innocent mother, protecting her baby from her unstable husband. Nothing I said would matter, because she had gotten to them first. I asked if Jessica and I could talk privately. She shook her head and said anything I had to say could be said in front of her family. Her mother agreed and said Jessica needed their support and protection. I looked at my wife holding our daughter, and I saw a stranger looking back at me. Her family did not leave until after midnight. Each of them made sure to tell me on the way out that they were watching me, that they would protect Jessica and the baby no matter what. When the last car finally pulled away, Jessica and I sat in cold silence in the living room, with our daughter sleeping between us in her bassinet. Then Jessica looked at me and said, I had a choice to make. I could apologize to her entire family for what I had done, admit I was wrong to take the baby without her permission, and promise to never let my family near our daughter without Jessica's explicit approval. Or I could refuse, and she would make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life. I told her I was not apologizing for letting my parents meet their granddaughter. She picked up the bassinet, carried it to our bedroom, locked the door behind her, and left me standing alone in the living room. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to my daughter cry through the walls while Jessica refused to let me in to help. The next morning, Jessica's family started their attack through every channel they had. My phone started buzzing before 7 with text messages from her mother, her father, and her siblings, all of them telling me I needed to apologize and fix what I had broken. Jessica's mother posted on social media about protecting babies from dangerous people, keeping the post vague enough that anyone reading it would fill in their own worst fears. Her friends commented immediately with support, asking if she was okay and offering to help however they could. Her father shared articles about parental rights and custody battles, each one with a pointed caption about fathers who try to control their families. By noon, my own relatives were calling me after seeing the posts, asking if everything was okay and what was really going on. I tried explaining, but it sounded crazy even to my own ears. My wife would not let my family meet our baby, but her family visited every day. She called the police when I took our daughter to meet my parents. Now her entire family was attacking me online and through texts. Even when I said it out loud, it somehow sounded like I was the problem. Jessica refused to speak to me directly. She sent all communication through her mother, who called every few hours with new ultimatums and demands. By the end of the second day, I had more than 100 messages across texts, emails, and social media, all painting me as an unstable father who had kidnapped his own child. Then Amy showed up at my workplace during my lunch break, looking over her shoulder as she walked through the parking lot like someone had followed her. She had her laptop under her arm and asked if we could talk somewhere private. We sat in my car, and she opened a private online group chat that made my stomach turn. Jessica had been documenting her strategy since the 6th month of her pregnancy, complete with advice from other women about how to legally exclude in-laws and establish sole control over baby access. The messages went back months. They showed Jessica researching parental rights laws in our state, asking how to build a case for me being unstable, and celebrating every time she successfully kept my family away during doctor appointments and hospital visits. One woman told Jessica to start documenting everything I did wrong, even small things, so she could build a pattern of concerning behavior. Another woman suggested Jessica talk to a lawyer before the baby was born to understand her rights. Jessica had replied that she had already consulted with someone and knew exactly what she needed to do. Amy scrolled through message after message, showing me a calculated plan to control access to our daughter. This was not something that had happened because Jessica was exhausted or emotional in the moment. This had been building long before our daughter was even born. I took a personal day from work and drove to meet with Samir Carlson, the family law attorney my sister had found while researching parental rights. His office was in a building downtown, the kind of place that felt too expensive for me, but I did not have a choice anymore. Samir reviewed everything I brought. He spread Amy's screenshots across his desk next to the text messages, the police report from Jessica's false kidnapping claim, and the video my father had taken of Jessica's mother threatening me on my parents' porch. He explained that I had equal parental rights regardless of who had given birth, that Jessica could not legally prevent me from taking our daughter places, and that her pattern of behavior could actually work against her in any custody dispute. Then he asked if I wanted to try to save the marriage, or if I was ready to file for separation and custody. I told him I did not know yet. I just needed to understand my rights and protect my family's ability to see their granddaughter. Samir said he would draft a letter to Jessica outlining my parental rights and her legal obligations, and that if she continued interfering, we could file for a formal custody arrangement. Jessica somehow found out I had met with an attorney within hours of me leaving Samir's office. I suspected her mother had been following me or checking my credit card statements, because there was no other way she could have known that quickly. When I got home that evening, I found the locks changed on our bedroom and the nursery. A note was taped to the bedroom door telling me I could sleep in the guest room until I came to my senses. I tried the door handle and found it locked. I called Jessica's phone and went straight to voicemail. When I called her mother, she answered on the second ring and told me she had moved into our house to support Jessica during this difficult time. She said Jessica and the baby were sleeping in the nursery, and I was not welcome in either room until I apologized and agreed to Jessica's terms. I asked where I was supposed to sleep. She said the guest room was perfectly comfortable and that maybe some time alone would help me think about what I had done. That night, when I checked our bank accounts, I found that Jessica had changed all the passwords and moved most of our money into accounts with only her name on them. My mother reached out to a professional mediator she had found through our church, hoping we could resolve this before it became a full legal battle. Surprisingly, Jessica agreed to meet, as long as her mother could attend. The mediation session happened at a neutral office in a building near the courthouse. We sat around a conference table, me and my parents on one side, Jessica and her mother on the other, with the mediator at the head trying to facilitate the conversation. Within 15 minutes, it became clear the meeting was a disaster. Jessica's mother dominated the entire conversation. She interrupted the mediator, spoke for Jessica, and rejected every suggestion before Jessica could even respond. The mediator had to ask her repeatedly to let Jessica speak for herself, but Jessica just cried and repeated that I had betrayed her trust. My parents offered compromise after compromise. They said they would accept supervised visits, short meetings, whatever Jessica needed to feel comfortable. Jessica's mother rejected all of it. She said my family could not be trusted, that they had already proven they did not respect Jessica's boundaries by encouraging me to take the baby without permission. Jessica nodded along with everything her mother said, never contradicting her, never offering her own thoughts. The mediator finally suggested we take a break. When we came back, Jessica and her mother announced they were leaving because this was clearly a waste of time. 2 days after the failed mediation, someone walked into my office at work, carrying a manila envelope with my name on it. I was served with legal papers, right there in front of my coworkers. Jessica had filed for an emergency custody order claiming I had kidnapped our daughter, exhibited unstable and threatening behavior, and that she feared for the baby's safety in my care. The petition included statements from her mother and 2 of her friends, describing me as controlling and aggressive, painting a picture of me that was not true, but sounded terrible on paper. I forwarded the documents to Samir immediately. He called me within minutes, his voice tight with urgency. He told me we needed to respond quickly, because the emergency hearing was scheduled in just 5 days, and we needed to gather all of our evidence and prepare for court. The emergency custody hearing took place in a small courtroom with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs. Jessica's lawyer presented her as a frightened new mother, protecting her infant from an unstable father. He used her statements and her mother's testimony to build a narrative of me as dangerous and unpredictable. Then Samir stood up and presented the text messages Amy had provided, showing Jessica's premeditated plan to exclude my family. The judge put on her reading glasses and went through Jessica's own words about breaking my family's spirits and making them beg and grovel. She looked up at Jessica with clear disapproval and asked Jessica's lawyer if he was aware his client had documented her intentions to manipulate custody access. Jessica's face went white as the judge continued reading through the messages. Then the judge read out loud the message where Jessica laughed about my grandmother being in the hospital, called her dramatic, and said old people always used health scares for attention. After that, she read the part where Jessica wrote that she hoped my grandmother would pass before the baby was old enough to remember her, so she would not have to deal with visits. The courtroom went silent. Jessica's lawyer tried to interrupt, saying the messages were private conversations and were not meant for legal proceedings. But the judge held up her hand and kept reading. She went through message after message where Jessica described her plans to break my family's spirit, to make them beg, and to establish dominance from day one. When she finished, she took off her glasses and looked directly at Jessica with an expression that made even Jessica's mother stop talking. The judge denied the emergency custody request completely. She said there was no evidence that I posed any danger to our daughter. Then she ordered a temporary custody arrangement where Jessica and I would each have the baby for 3 days at a time until a full hearing could happen. Jessica started crying immediately, loud sobs that echoed through the small courtroom. But the judge was not finished. She mandated that we both attend family counseling twice a week with a therapist she would assign. Then she warned Jessica very clearly that the documented statements about deliberately excluding my family could be considered parental alienation if the pattern continued. Jessica's mother stood up and started arguing with the judge, saying new mothers needed protection and support, not punishment, and asking whether the court understood how vulnerable Jessica was after giving birth. The judge told her to sit down or she would be removed from the courtroom. Jessica's lawyer pulled her mother back into her seat while Jessica kept crying, and I could see Samir beside me writing notes about everything that was happening. The judge set a date for the full custody hearing 6 weeks away and told both of us that we needed to follow the 3-day schedule exactly. No exceptions, no flexibility without court approval. We left through different exits, and I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes just trying to process what had happened. 3 days later, I drove to an office building downtown for our first mandated counseling session with Wilhelmina Gentry. The waiting room had uncomfortable chairs and old magazines, and Jessica was already there with her mother sitting beside her and holding her hand. Wilhelmina called us back to her office, a small room with 2 couches facing each other and a chair where she sat with a notepad. Jessica's mother tried to follow us in, but Wilhelmina stopped her at the door and said this was for parents only. The session started with Wilhelmina asking each of us to describe what had brought us there. Jessica immediately launched into crying and talking about how hard labor had been, how overwhelmed she felt, and how nobody understood what new mothers went through. She talked for probably 20 minutes about her birth experience, about sleepless nights, and about how scary it was to be responsible for a tiny human. Wilhelmina listened patiently, nodding occasionally and writing notes. Then she asked Jessica directly about the text messages, describing her plan to exclude my family. And Jessica's whole demeanor changed. She stopped crying and said the messages had been taken out of context. She said she had only been venting to friends the way all new mothers do, and that everyone says things they do not mean when they are stressed. Wilhelmina asked what context would make hoping someone's grandmother dies acceptable, and Jessica's face went red. She said Wilhelmina was biased against mothers, that therapists were supposed to be supportive, and that Wilhelmina was twisting her words to make her look bad. Wilhelmina stayed calm and said she was simply reading what Jessica had written in her own words. Jessica crossed her arms and refused to talk for the rest of the hour. Wilhelmina documented that in her notes. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was at work, and Amy's name flashed on the screen. She was talking fast, her voice shaking, saying I needed to know what had just happened. Jessica's mother had shown up at Amy's apartment that morning with $2,000 in cash spread out on Amy's kitchen table. She had begged Amy to tell the court she had made up the text messages, or that I had somehow manipulated her into providing them, or that Amy had misunderstood what Jessica meant. Amy had started recording on her phone the moment she realized what was happening, and she captured everything. Her mother's voice on the recording was desperate at first, offering the money. Then it turned threatening. She told Amy she would cut her off financially if she did not help Jessica. She said the whole family would turn against Amy, that Amy would be blamed for destroying Jessica's life, and that she would never be welcome at family events again. Amy told her mother no. She said she was not going to lie in court. Her mother left the cash on the table and walked out. Amy forwarded me the recording file while we were still on the phone, and I could hear her crying as she told me she was done protecting Jessica from the consequences of her own actions. She said losing her relationship with their mother was worth it if it meant doing the right thing, but her voice broke when she said it. The first day of my 3-day custody period, under the court order, felt like Christmas morning when I was a kid. I picked up our daughter from Jessica's mother's house, where they had been staying, and Jessica handed her over without looking at me. I drove straight to my grandmother's house, where she was recovering at home from surgery. My whole family was already there waiting. When I walked in carrying the baby, my grandmother started crying. She held her great-granddaughter for the first time, touching her tiny fingers and looking at her face like she was trying to memorize every detail. My mother took photos of 4 generations together. My grandmother in her recliner holding the baby, my mother standing behind her, and me beside them. My sister finally got to hold her niece. She sat on the couch and stared at her for long minutes without saying anything. My father sat quietly in his chair, with the baby sleeping on his chest, and I watched his face relax in a way I had not seen in weeks. Nobody tried to do too much. Nobody overwhelmed the baby. We just sat together in my grandmother's living room, passing her around gently and letting everyone have their turn. My mother made lunch, and we ate while the baby slept. For a few hours, everything felt normal and right. Before I left, my grandmother told me she had been praying for that moment, and that she had not been sure she would live to see it. I had to turn away so she would not see me crying. The 3 days with my family passed too quickly. Sunday evening came, and I was supposed to return the baby to Jessica. I drove to our house at the agreed time, 6 o'clock, but Jessica's car was not in the driveway. I called her phone, and it went straight to voicemail. I texted her, asking where she was, and got no response. I sat in my car with the baby in her car seat behind me, waiting and checking my phone every few minutes. 7 o'clock passed. Then 8. Finally, at 8:15, Jessica's mother texted me saying Jessica was not ready to take the baby back yet, and that I needed to be more flexible about the schedule. I took screenshots of everything with timestamps, the unanswered calls, the texts, and the time showing on my phone. Then I called Samir, and he answered on the second ring. He told me to contact the police non-emergency line and report a custody order violation because we needed to document it officially. I made the call while sitting in my driveway, and the dispatcher said officers would be sent to Jessica's location. 2 police officers showed up at the house about 30 minutes later. I had driven there and was waiting outside when they arrived, standing on the sidewalk and holding the baby. The officers knocked on the door, and Jessica's mother answered. She immediately started talking about how mothers have more rights than fathers, how the schedule was too rigid, and how Jessica needed more time. One of the officers was a woman, and she cut Jessica's mother off mid-sentence. She explained very clearly that the custody order was a court mandate, not a suggestion, and that Jessica needed to comply immediately. Jessica's mother argued that the court did not understand what new mothers needed, and the officer told her that continuing to violate the order could result in contempt of court charges. Jessica finally came to the door, her eyes red from crying. The officer asked if she was refusing to take custody of her child at the court-ordered time. Jessica reached for the baby, and I handed her over. She started crying dramatically while holding her. The officers documented everything in their report, writing down the time, the delay, and Jessica's mother's statements. They told us both that the next exchange needed to happen on time, or there would be legal consequences, and then they left. Our next counseling session happened 3 days later. Wilhelmina started by saying she had reviewed her notes from our first session and had some recommendations. She looked at Jessica and said she was recommending individual therapy to address what she had identified as control issues stemming from past relationship trauma. Jessica's face went pale, and she started to interrupt, But Wilhelmina kept talking. She said she had noted concerning patterns in how Jessica used the baby as a weapon against my family. She said that while Jessica's feelings about her ex's mother were valid, she was now punishing people who had nothing to do with that situation. Wilhelmina explained that Jessica was using our daughter to settle old emotional scores from a completely different relationship, and that it was not healthy for anyone involved. Jessica stood up and said Wilhelmina did not understand anything. She said Wilhelmina was supposed to be helping but was just making things worse. Wilhelmina stayed calm and said she was trying to help Jessica see the patterns in her behavior before they damaged her relationship with her daughter permanently. Jessica grabbed her purse and walked out of the session halfway through, leaving me sitting there alone with Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina wrote something in her notes and said she would be documenting the walkout in her report to the court. Over the next 2 weeks, I started noticing cracks in Jessica's family support system. Amy had completely sided with me and had moved out of her parents' house into an apartment with a roommate. Then Chase, Jessica's younger brother, started texting me privately, saying he thought his sister had gone too far. He said he had tried talking to Jessica about compromise, and she had screamed at him that he was betraying her, that everyone was against her, and that she was the victim in all of this. Chase told me their father was getting tired of the drama and just wanted Jessica to work out a reasonable custody arrangement so the family could move on. Jessica's mother was becoming increasingly isolated in her support of Jessica's extreme position. Even some of Jessica's friends had stopped commenting on her social media posts, and the ones who did comment were suggesting she consider therapy or mediation. Chase sent me screenshots of the family group chat where their father had written that Jessica needed to accept reality and stop fighting a battle she had already lost. Jessica had responded by leaving the group chat entirely. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica asking if we could meet alone. No lawyers, no family. We agreed to meet in a parking lot near our house, neutral territory where neither of us would feel ambushed. I got there first and sat in my car waiting. When she pulled up beside me, she looked exhausted. We both got out, and then we sat in her car because it was raining. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. Then Jessica started talking, her voice quiet and shaky. She said she had been scared since she got pregnant that she would lose control the way she had with Christopher's mother. She said, seeing my family's excitement had triggered all those old feelings of being overwhelmed and powerless. She admitted that Christopher's mother had taken over everything. The wedding planning, their lives, every decision. It had been suffocating. When that relationship ended, Jessica had promised herself she would never let that happen again. But now she realized she had gone too far in the other direction. I told her I understood being hurt by past experiences. I understood why she had been scared. But our daughter deserved to know both families. I told her I could not stay married to someone who would use our child as a weapon to hurt people I loved, and that I could not watch her punish my family for things Christopher's mother had done. We both cried in her car while rain hit the windshield. Jessica said she did not know if she could change enough to make the marriage work. I told her I did not know either. 6 weeks after the emergency hearing, we were back in court for the full custody hearing. This time, both sides had complete cases prepared with evidence, witness statements, and professional recommendations. Jessica's lawyer presented her side first, focusing on bonding, breastfeeding, maternal instinct, and how emotionally vulnerable she had been after giving birth. Then, Samir presented our evidence, including the new recording of Jessica's mother trying to bribe Amy, the police report from the custody violation, and Wilhelmina's detailed notes about Jessica walking out of therapy. Wilhelmina's written report recommended equal custody with structured exchanges. The report noted that Jessica had started to acknowledge some of her control issues, but it also documented her continued resistance to allowing my family unsupervised access to the baby. The judge read through everything carefully, taking her time and asking questions about specific incidents and timeline details. Then she established a permanent custody arrangement. Jessica and I would each have the baby for alternating weeks, and both families would be allowed to visit during our respective custody times without requiring the other parent's permission. Jessica started crying again, but this time she did not argue. Her lawyer said they would comply with the order. I started going to my individual therapy sessions every Tuesday evening, and Jessica went to hers on Thursday afternoons with a different therapist the court approved. Wilhelmina continued working with both of us separately, checking in on how we were handling the custody arrangement and whether we were making progress on the issues that had brought us to court in the first place. About 6 weeks into the new schedule, Wilhelmina called me after one of her sessions with Jessica and asked if we could meet for coffee to talk about something off the record. We sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near her office, and she told me Jessica was finally doing real work on her trauma from Christopher, instead of just blaming everyone else for her problems. Wilhelmina said Jessica had spent weeks deflecting and making excuses. But something had shifted recently. She was starting to acknowledge how she had recreated the exact control dynamic she hated, only this time with herself holding all the power. Wilhelmina could not share specific details because of confidentiality, but she wanted me to know that Jessica was making genuine progress and might actually be capable of being a good co-parent eventually. I thanked her for telling me, even though it did not change the fact that our marriage was probably over. 3 days later, Jessica called me during her custody week around 8 in the evening. I almost did not answer, because by then, we usually only texted about pickup times and baby supplies. But something made me pick up. Her voice sounded different, quieter, and less defensive than I had heard in months. She apologized for everything. Really apologized. She did not make excuses, and she did not blame other people. She said her therapist was helping her see how she had used our daughter as a weapon to hurt my family because she was scared of losing control again. She told me more about Christopher's mother taking over their wedding planning, choosing everything from flowers to the menu to the guest list without asking what Jessica wanted. She said it had felt like drowning, like she was just a prop in someone else's event. When the engagement ended, she promised herself she would never feel that powerless again. But then she got pregnant, saw my mother's excitement, and all those old feelings came back. Instead of talking to me about it, she built an entire strategy to make sure my family knew they had no power over our baby. She said she understood now that she had gone too far in the other direction. She had become the controlling person she hated. She was sorry for what she had done to my grandmother, my sister, and my parents. It did not fix our marriage, and we both knew that. But it was the first time she had taken real responsibility for her actions instead of justifying them. 2 weeks later, both families sat down together in Wilhelmina's office for a mediation session to establish clear boundaries and a visitation schedule now that the custody arrangement was permanent. Jessica's mother showed up looking tense and unhappy. My parents came in looking cautious but hopeful. Wilhelmina started by explaining that we needed to create rules that worked for everyone and that both sides would need to compromise. Jessica's mother immediately said she should be able to visit whenever she wanted during Jessica's custody weeks because she was the maternal grandmother and had a special bond with the baby. Wilhelmina gently redirected her and said that was exactly the kind of thinking that had caused problems, because both sets of grandparents had equal importance in the baby's life. We spent 2 hours working through a schedule where both sets of grandparents could visit during our respective custody weeks, but everyone needed to call first and respect it if we said it was not a good time. Jessica's mother struggled the most with accepting limits. She argued that she had been there from day one and should not be treated the same as my parents, who had been excluded. But Jessica actually backed up the boundaries we were setting. She told her mother she could visit during Jessica's weeks, but she needed to call ahead and could not just show up anymore. My parents agreed to the same rules without arguing. We created a shared calendar on our phones, so everyone knew the schedule, and there would be no confusion about who had the baby when. During my custody weeks, my family settled into a comfortable routine. My parents came over for dinner twice a week, usually on Tuesday and Friday evenings. My sister started video calling from across the country every Sunday morning so she could see the baby and talk to me about how things were going. My grandmother visited every Sunday afternoon, sitting in my living room, holding her great-granddaughter, and telling stories about when my father was young. The baby was thriving with regular time with both families. I could see her starting to recognize different people and respond to familiar faces. She smiled when my mother picked her up. She reached for my father's glasses. She had gotten used to my grandmother's soft voice during those Sunday visits. One evening, while my mother and I were cleaning up after dinner, she told me she was grateful we had fought for this, even though it had cost us our marriage, because my daughter would grow up knowing she was loved by everyone, not just one side of her family. 6 months after that terrible day when I first took the baby to meet my parents, I was living in my own apartment about 15 minutes from our old house. Jessica and I had worked out a functional co-parenting relationship that was better than our marriage had been toward the end, probably because we were not trying to be married anymore and could simply focus on raising our daughter. We exchanged the baby every Sunday evening at 6, meeting in the parking lot of a park halfway between our places. The handoffs were usually quick and drama-free, just updates about the baby's schedule and any supplies that needed to be restocked. Both families had regular access during our respective weeks, and nobody needed permission from the other parent anymore because the court order had settled that question permanently. Jessica had even apologized to my grandmother directly, calling her one afternoon and telling her she was sorry for the cruel things she had said when my grandmother was in the hospital. My grandmother cried and forgave her immediately, because that was the kind of person she was. Our daughter would grow up in 2 households instead of 1, spending half her time with me and my family and half her time with Jessica and hers. It was not the life I had imagined when we got married and planned to have children together, but she would know both families loved her and wanted to be part of her life. Sometimes that is the best outcome you can hope for when adults make mistakes that cannot be undone. Sometimes the damage to a marriage is too deep to repair. but you can still build something functional for your child. I was sad our marriage had not survived. I was sad my daughter would grow up going back and forth between two homes instead of having both parents together. But I was proud I had stood up for my family's right to know their granddaughter. I was proud I had not backed down when Jessica tried to use our baby as a weapon.